Paul.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Gore, for giving me this opportunity, and of course to the Foreign Policy School. Um, Let me just begin by saying that I think we are all aware that circumstances in Afghanistan have drastically evolved, and they continue to do so since the Taliban came into power. Now, I'm going to be very honest and frank in my views over here. Let me just begin again by saying that whether we like it or not, the Taliban are a reality. Now, they did not come into power in Afghanistan through force or isolation, but they came through a process. And that process is the Doha Agreement. Now, we may disagree on a number of issues regarding the agreement, because certainly there were a number of drawbacks, primarily the fact that they excluded Kabul. But, and we can rightfully criticize the agreement, again, for all its shortcomings. But let us not forget that it was endorsed by all the major stakeholders. And therefore, it is an agreement that I think should be acknowledged, and I think it should be respected, and I think it should be honored by the two principal stakeholders, and that, of course, is the United States and the Taliban. We've seen that while there is no recognition of the group, there is engagement, and in my limited knowledge, that means de facto recognition, if not de jure. Because if you see, regional countries are directly engaging with the Taliban, whereas the international community has been doing it through Doha. Moreover, you have seen, embassies, while regional countries, I think with the exception of India, the others had, continued to keep their ambassadors in Afghanistan or their charge d'affaires. Even now, India has come back and, it has opened its embassy. Moreover, you have the OIC and the EU that have opened their missions back in Afghanistan. So again, I focus on this particular point that while it's not de jure, but the engagement is de facto recognition. Now, therefore, again, I say that it is important to understand and hold both sides accountable and ensure that those principles that were agreed upon in the Doha Agreement are, implemented in letter and spirit. Now, the Taliban have been in power for a little more than a year. And while there were questions as to what the Taliban rule would mean for, say, internally domestic governance, human women's rights, political freedoms, but of course also issues revolving around counterterrorism, and I think more importantly, regional peace and stability. Now, again, while there were questions, I think this 1 year has certainly set the tone, and I think it is an indication of how the group is going to govern the country. Now, this past year has also shown that the real test for the Taliban is not just about gaining power, but I think it revolves more about legitimacy, acceptance, performance, and ultimately the question of recognition, which they so badly are striving for. Now, we have seen that the biggest threats in Afghanistan are domestic in nature, and these are, of course, revolving around the humanitarian crisis, the non-existent economy, and more importantly, the presence of transnational terrorist elements. Now, with the exception of the Islamic State of Khorasan province, there has been an overall improvement in the security. But of course, the question of human security remains ambiguous, to say the least. And more so, the presence of the ISKP has been the biggest factor regarding any sort of violence that has taken place in Afghanistan. And I think this is an important factor to remember. Now, while there has been an improvement in security, let's be honest, the group's inability or unwillingness, however one wants to term it, to fulfill their pledges of reform pertaining to human or women's rights, the right to education, and of course, this whole issue of an inclusive government is a major stumbling block. It's an issue of concern, and it continues to keep the international community at bay from engaging with the Taliban. And I think this is an area that the Taliban really need to focus on. While I understand that they, face several challenges when it comes to governance, simply because they don't have the capacity or the means to govern the country, they don't have the skills, because of course we've seen a major brain drain taking place in Afghanistan, and of course even limitations in using Afghanistan's resources. But the fact is that now that they are in power, they need to get legitimacy from the Afghan masses. And that can only happen when they focus on delivering the basic yet fundamental rights to every individual. And being, the Taliban, The term Talib itself means a student. I find it ironic that they are not allowing, individuals, whether it's, of course, it shouldn't be a gender issue, but primarily not letting women go to school is just, something that is unacceptable. Therefore, they need to honor these very basic yet fundamental rights. And if they don't do so, I think it's going to become extremely difficult for not only the international community, but I think regional countries to move beyond engagement. Because I don't think any country wants to be associated with a group that doesn't, allow these basic, yet again, reiterate fundamental rights. And I think therefore you have seen that regional countries, there is no recognition. No regional country, including Pakistan, despite the relationship we have had with the Taliban, has not moved or pushed for recognition. Now, let me quickly just touch upon another factor that I did mention earlier on, but I think it's something that certainly warrants recognition, and that is the presence of these transnational terrorist groups, and of course, the whole Zawahiri incident. Now, in my opinion, I don't think the biggest threat to Afghanistan is, say, internal opposition, because I feel that the National Resistance Front has not been able to muster that kind of support as it did, say, 2 decades ago. I think it's more, the threat is more about these transnational terrorist groups taking advantage of the situation and filling in the vacuum that the Taliban will not be able to do simply because they don't have the means or the wills. And again, because of their stubborn attitude, which is limiting the international community from engaging with them. Now, since August 2021, since the group took over, we have seen a spike in these terrorist activities, particularly directed towards Afghanistan's neighbors, the TTP in Pakistan's case, but then you've seen attacks by the ISKP against Uzbekistan, certain attacks against Tajikistan, and of course, we've seen it also with the attack on the Russian embassy. So therefore, I think, this puts into question, again, the Taliban's ability and willingness to deal with these terrorist elements. And to be honest with you, I think there is a growing sense of frustration as well amongst Afghanistan's immediate neighbors because of the Taliban's inability or just lack of willingness to deal with these groups. And again, one understands that the Taliban are consolidating their position. They are new in the whole issue of governance. But again, these are areas that they need to deliver on. And these are, by the way, the same areas that were agreed upon in the Doha Agreement. And I think for the Taliban, they seem to think that these counterterrorism assurances are only for the international community, but they fail to understand that they need to secure and win the confidence of the regional countries first. And therefore, these counterterrorism assurances apply to regional countries as well. And if they don't do so, again, it will be very difficult for the regional countries to want to engage further with Afghanistan other than the humanitarian issue. Now, interestingly, while these are the negatives, there have been certain positives as well. And again, I feel that, one should look at a situation through a very balanced approach and call a spade a spade. And here, I think it's important to focus on the fact that the Taliban, despite the fact that they've had very limited, capacity, have been able to clamp down on corruption, and they've been able to publish a budget that, they've been able to generate domestic revenue, of course, primarily through, cracking down on corruption, but also through customs and tariff duties. And let me just give you a small figure. From September to December 2021, they were able to generate around $400 million, again, through revenues, taxes, and of course, an increase in the export of coal. And interestingly, and this might come as a surprise to many, but the bilateral trade between Pakistan and Afghanistan this year was in favor of the government in Afghanistan, where Afghan exports to Pakistan increased from around, I think it's 550 million to 700 million. And interestingly, while Pakistan's exports might have decreased to Afghanistan, their exports to the Central Asian republics, they rose by about 70%, from 118 million to 202 million. So this just shows you that even though the situation is not ripe, there are a number of challenges. Trade is one area that can deliver. And here, I think it's important to focus on trade in terms of regional, connectivity and regional trade. And I feel that Afghanistan, if some semblance of stability comes to Afghanistan, I think Afghanistan could play the role of a regional roundabout, where all regional countries, including India as well, and Pakistan could find a common ground to move forward. I think this is an area that really needs to be explored, because I feel that if whenever there is economic interdependence, it does reduce the chances of conflict. And one hopes that Afghanistan could prove to be that common ground even for India and Pakistan. Now, let me just say 3 points on the region. Now, it is interesting, but despite previous differences and divergences, there is this strange strategic coincidence within the region where Afghanistan's immediate neighbors appear to be on the same page when it comes to Afghanistan. Whether it's Iran, Pakistan, China, the Central Asians, or the Russians, they all are following the same policy as the international community, where their expectations from the Taliban are exactly the same as those that the international community expects. And it's interesting that every regional country, by the way, even India has been now more recently engaging with the Taliban bilaterally. Unfortunately, there is no regional framework as such, and I'm not talking about the Tashkent conference, because that is more towards economics. There isn't really a regional mechanism where all these regional countries can, under that umbrella, engage with the Taliban. I think that is missing, and that is very important, because bilaterally every country is engaging, but again, it is important for the region to take ownership, and that will only happen when you have some sort of a mechanism which could not only focus, I think, on the humanitarian aspect, but more so, trade, connectivity, the economics, and of course, counterterrorism, cooperation. Again, that is very, very important. And therefore, I feel that this is lacking. And one hopes that maybe something similar to the Quad that existed before, but in a larger framework, could be reinitiated, where the Americans could also come in and play a role. Now, again, there's a realization that while we understand the limitations that the Taliban have, because look, they have recently come into power, and I think it is a little unfair to expect them to deliver so soon and so quickly. But that does not mean that one does not hold them accountable. They should be held accountable, and they should, honor their pledges that they agreed upon in the Doha Agreement. And therefore, I feel that it is important to remain engaged. And I think while recognition seems to be a faraway, issue at the moment, engagement is certainly necessary. Now, here, let me just quickly talk about the international community as well, and just say that while, they keep on talking about, well, the sanctions continue to exist, I feel this is a little disingenuous on the part of the international community, because I'll come back to the point where I initiated this, discussion, that the Taliban came into power through a process. And at that time, they were not being called a terrorist organization. That agreement has been signed. So now that they are in power, they need to be assisted. And I feel that this whole issue of sanctions is not affecting the Taliban. The Taliban do not need this money. It's the common Afghan that is suffering. And therefore, I understand the sensitivities involved in the whole 9.5 billion that is associated with 9/11 victims. But that does not mean that other means and measures cannot be found to provide some sort of economic assistance. And I'm not talking about humanitarian aid. These are two different things. The Afghan economy, 90% of it, we all know, has been dependent on the international community. Therefore, how does the international community expect the Taliban to generate or reinitiate the Afghan economy when it never existed? And the fact that they've been able to, in their limited capacity, generate some income, I think is praiseworthy, but it's not enough to sustain the Afghan population. And therefore, this issue needs to be revisited. And therefore, sanctions should not be associated with the Taliban. Because again, it's at the end of the day, it's the common Afghan that suffers. Another issue I think that needs or warrants recognition is the fact that no two conflicts should take precedence over the other. And we see, with the situation in Ukraine, Afghanistan has been somewhat put on the back burner, and it has been considered as a regional issue, where I think everybody fails to understand that Afghanistan is an area that has always had global ramifications. And therefore, I think it is essential that Afghanistan is viewed not as a regional issue, because again, I will mention that the biggest mistake that was made was when the Doha Agreement was being signed, the region was not taken into confidence. So therefore, it is unfair to pin the responsibility on the region. Afghanistan is a collective issue, and it warrants a shared response, and therefore every major stakeholder has to play its part, including the Taliban as well. And another important question here is, if not the Taliban, then who else? Is there any viable alternative? To be quite honest, not really, because again, as I mentioned, the National Resistance Front is not united as it should be. The opposition isn't united as it should be. And moreover, there is no, I think these groups have failed to muster up necessary support to fight against the Taliban. And I think the Americans in the international community have made it very clear that they will not support any armed struggle. So therefore, if that is the issue, then I think it's important to work with the Taliban. That does not mean giving them a clean check. That does not mean not holding them accountable. Rather, it means holding them accountable and ensuring that they deliver. And I think through engagement, this can really work. But disengagement is not going to work. And therefore, I feel it's necessary for the international community to come back to Afghanistan, because it is only when they are on the ground where they will be able to hold the Taliban responsible. Now, the Taliban also need to deliver on, again, their pledges of reform, as I keep on talking about. I'll just mention here that while we're talking about inclusivity a lot, this is an issue that comes up time and again, that, well, the government in Afghanistan isn't as inclusive as it should be. I think we need to keep in mind the domestic constraints and the domestic environment and architecture of every particular country. And while the Taliban have included members from the Tajik and the Uzbek community, again, which warrants recognition, because remember, this is a group that was solely Pashtun. So the fact that they do have other ethnicities is, again, something that should be recognized. But I don't think the international community should put figures in there, where this much percentage should be and that much. I think this is something that is an internal issue, and therefore I think it's important for the Taliban to engage certainly with other political factions, but more so they need to focus on their pledges of reform, which again revolve around human women's rights, and of course, more importantly, focusing on these counterterrorism assurances, because this is important to keep in mind. Now, I'll just end here by saying that, it is important for the international community to revisit its policies, particularly when it comes to sanctions. But I think it is equally important for the Taliban as well to deliver on their pledges and promises of reform. And therefore, a policy of patience yet persistence needs to be followed. And one last point here is that I think it's important for a regional framework. And again, I think the Quad is a good example where we could have other countries join as well. Initially started with the immediate neighborhood and have the US in it and then expand it. And, again, engagement is the way forward. So I'll end here and then maybe we could have like a discussion on this. I think I've covered most of the points. If there's anything, I'm open to discussion.
Thank you very much for a brief and at the same time comprehensive coverage of the issues that are being faced by Afghanistan, and what more should be done to get justice for Afghanistan, the Afghanistan people. I think so many suggestions have been made by you. We hope they are taken note of by the international community, the regional countries and all that. And now I would like to open the house for questions. I ask the participants to come with their questions. First, let them introduce themselves and then put the question in a simple and clear manner. Yes, come on, be quick.
Good evening, ma'am. Ma'am, I'm Riya Sharma and currently I'm pursuing my master's in political science. Ma'am, many countries still now, they hesitate to establish fully fledged relations with the Taliban regime. And ma'am, this is one of the reasons why connectivity projects in the region have come to a standstill. Ma'am, my question is, how can regional players continue or resume these connectivity and developmental projects without establishing such fluid relations with the Taliban regime?
I think that that's a very interesting question. And I think the biggest example of this is Uzbekistan, where you have seen that while Uzbekistan, like other regional countries, has not recognized the Taliban, but Connectivity projects are taking place, such as the road and rail network that starts from Uzbekistan and then, starts from Uzbekistan, crosses Afghanistan, and then comes to Pakistan. Work is on this, and it's moving at a very, very, impetus pace. Sorry. More than that, if you see the Tashkent conference, again, that's solely revolved around economics, around trade, and connectivity. The Chinese are paying a number of visits, and they are very interested in extending CPEC to Afghanistan. And interestingly, let me tell you that while the previous regime of President Ashraf Ghani had put conditions on CPEC, saying that no, first Pakistan has to allow us to get access to through Pakistan has to give us access to the Wagah border to get to India, then we will consider CPEC. The Taliban have not put such conditions. They are open to all forms of connectivity. Moreover, there is an air freight corridor with India, and I believe that that has not stopped. There is no, there are some logistical issues, but it's not that the Taliban have withdrawn from that agreement. Similarly with Chabahar. So I think it's more about being practical, because recognition is an issue that will take quite some time, because once you recognize a country, then there's going to be a number of issues that the country will have to answer for. But trade is something that is very practical, and I think it's taking place, and you see it particularly under the Taliban regime, where they are focusing. They know that they need to generate some sort of money for their economy, and that can only happen through these projects. And I think you're going to see more of this happening in the region. While yes, we talk about CASA 1000 and all that, they might be slowed down, but certainly other routes are going to definitely open up.
Ma'am, I have one more question. Ma'am, I read that the US withdrawal from Afghanistan exhibits its disinterest in the region, and therefore the Arab states now see Israel as a security provider, and that is why they're easing up with Israel via the Abraham Accords. Ma'am, does US withdrawal really pose a security threat for the entire Arab region?
No, I don't think so. I think the Americans are very much there. It's a different question from what we're dealing with. But no, and I think the fact that the Quad was recently signed between, India, UAE, the 2+2 Quad, Israel, and of course, America, I think so. I don't see the Americans disengaging, security-wise from there. Certainly they won't, because the Chinese are also there, and the issue of the BRI connecting with all these visions that the Saudis have, the UAE has, Qatar has. So I don't think you're going to see as such disengagement by the US, certainly in security terms. No. Yes, the Americans are more interested in the Indo-Pacific, and of course with the AUKUS and the whole containment of China, but I don't think they're going to disengage completely when it comes to security in the Middle East.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
So any other question?
I think we have.
Yes, is there someone? I think there should be one more question.
Yes.
Yeah, Dr. Meenakshi Ghosh. She is very much actively associated with the FPS and FPRC, and she is the guest editor of our next issue of FPRC journal that focuses on India-Africa relations. And she has been very active about all this area problems and all that. So Dr. Ghosh, please go ahead with your questions if you have any. Dr. Meenakshi.
Good evening, ma'am. First of all, thank you so much for that enlightening session. My question to you is, China's Afghanistan policy is based on its two interests. One is stability in the Xinjiang province, so that there is no Islamic insurgency. And secondly is the trade with Central Asia, the energy and the mineral resources. So do you see that China will play a more proactive role in the future with its engagement with Afghanistan, mainly the Taliban regime?
Yes, thank you for that question. Yes, certainly. Look, China is one country that is viewed very positively by all Afghan factions, including the Taliban. And do not forget that it was the Chinese that have hosted a number of Track 2 publicly as well as privately, initiatives between the Taliban and the previous regime. Also, the Chinese played a role in securing the ceasefire, both in 2018 and 2019. So certainly China, I think for the first time, is playing a very pivotal and active role in an area outside its borders, and that is Afghanistan. It certainly has been able to develop a relationship with the Taliban. And I think the fact that the Taliban, even when the negotiations were taking place, used to say that we would like the Chinese to be mediators, shows that there is certainly trust between both the Chinese and the Taliban. The Chinese, yes, you're right, they are extremely concerned about the whole threat of the transnational terrorist groups operating in Afghanistan. And interestingly, it's the ISKP that is now collaborating with the ETIM, which has now a new name, which is the TIP. And this is an issue of concern for Afghanistan, sorry, for the Chinese. And that is why you're not seeing the kind of investment that I think the Chinese initially wanted to do, because they're very cautious. But that does not mean that they're not going to focus on connectivity. Every other week, you have a Chinese investor delegation in Afghanistan. About 3 months ago, about 70 Chinese companies visited Afghanistan. So I think they're going to focus on that. The INEC copper field is still there. So I think the Chinese are very interested also in the larger BRI, extending CPEC, as well as the South Central Asian groups. So I think you're going to see more of a role of the Chinese, but the Chinese are very cautious, remember that. And unless and until the Taliban are not able to create some semblance of security, the Chinese will invest, but very cautiously. But they will certainly not take any role as a security provider or facilitator in Afghanistan. I think no regional country is willing to do that. That is something that the Afghans have to do for themselves.
Thank you, ma'am.
So, any other question? And if there's no question, I would like to raise few issues for the guests. And I hope these queries are addressed by our guest speaker. My queries relate to your statement that we need a regional, framework relating to Afghanistan. You spoke about some sort of quad for Afghanistan and other regional countries and all that. Do you think it is feasible? I mean, can it be put into practice?
If push comes to shove, then anything can happen. And we've seen this happen before, where you've had the 6+2, you've had so many different initiatives. I just feel that I think it is important because you see, if every regional country continues to engage with the Taliban bilaterally, I don't think it will have the kind of impact that would come out of a regional framework. Because I think that will also give cover to regional countries to be able to engage in a more nuanced manner, but under the shadow of a regional framework. The concern, unfortunately, is that no regional country is willing to take the initiative because they don't want to make life easier for the Americans, because they feel that the Americans, are the principal stakeholders, and therefore, the Americans also need to take ownership. But certainly it is there. If you remember, just before the fall of Kabul, there was a sort of, you had the initial quadrilateral coordination group, which was China, Pakistan, the US and Afghanistan. Then you had another one, which included Uzbekistan. But I think if there's something on the regional front, where Afghanistan's immediate neighbors, plus, the Central Asians, and at a later stage, of course, extended to India as well, because I think it is very important for the region at large to have some sort of a framework. Because at the end of the day, every country faces the same threats from Afghanistan, and I think it has the same views of engaging with the Taliban. There is no difference. The international community appears to be on the same page, where our expectations are the same. So I think it is doable, but who is going to play the role of that regional interlocutor? That is a question that remains.
Do you think the initiative should come from Taliban?
I don't think the Taliban are going to do it as such. It has to be, I think, a regional country. And to be honest, a lot of, for example, Pakistan and Iran, And the Russians do have historical baggage in Afghanistan, you know. So I think that is why they are a little reluctant to do so. I think one country that could play that role is China, because you know it does have a good relationship with the Taliban and with other political factions, and it has this policy of non-interference. So that could happen, or maybe under the larger SCO framework, but this needs to be explored. But this is and I think regional ownership is very necessary. For how long is other regional countries going to depend on the international community to bail them out? I think the region needs to take ownership.
You are right to a great extent. Now, lastly, India has engaged with the Taliban regime. I mean, not too long ago, but in recent times. Do you see this engagement may turn into recognition of Taliban? Or do you think that India should do more in terms of engagement that has been done in the past?
Look, I think again, I think it is a welcome development. I think it's the Indians are being pragmatic because they know that the Taliban are here to stay, and therefore one has to engage with the Taliban. And I think you've seen positive overtures from the Taliban as well towards India. But I don't think you're going to see recognition, certainly not anytime soon. And I think the grounds need to be made for recognition from the Taliban. And I think it's very easy for the Taliban to do so. They need to move away from their very stubborn attitude when it comes to, again, very basic yet fundamental rights, allowing women to go to school. If they allow this and if they move forward on this front, I think you will see the international community willing to push towards recognition. But in my opinion, I think recognition is going to come, it'll come from the international community first, and then regional countries would do it. I don't think you're going to see any regional country willing to take that risk, because the Taliban haven't been able to provide that credibility. And to be fair, they've only been in power for more than, I mean, August was 1 year, so maybe 15, 14 months. I think time needs to be given. But the fact that regional countries are engaging is important.
Do you think that Taliban is going on the correct path to be recognized and to be held by the regional powers and the international community? Are they working on the correct line?
I think they're working in certain areas, but they need to again work more on the whole human security issue. And you know, the main, I think, stumbling block is this issue regarding women's rights and human and political freedoms. And the longer the Taliban continue to stall on this issue, it's creating problems, because this is an area where the Taliban can so easily deliver on. So I think engagement will be there, but the Taliban really need to do more when it comes to this particular issue.
I think that will be more symbolic in the eyes of the world if they allow certain freedom to their own country men, and particularly the issue of freedom to women and school-going children and all that. I think that will help a lot. I think
yes. And also, Professor Gaur, let me add here that I think countries are also a little reluctant to move beyond engagement, because they are also scared that, if this is a situation in Afghanistan where human freedoms are being suppressed, this might spill over into their country. And I think this is also the reason why countries are being very cautious in their engagement. And I think it is a no-brainer. And many, by the way, members within the Taliban recognize this need. Remember, just before the OIC summit, the Taliban had agreed to allow women to return to high schools. And then unfortunately, one day after that, they decided to revert that decision. But again, I think engagement will eventually compel the Taliban to agree to this particular issue.
Yes, that will be a golden day, I think, for Afghanistan and the people of Afghanistan, because the people of Afghanistan are not at fault. This is not their fault that they are suffering. It is, the mistakes, or you can say the lapses on the part of the other side, whether it is the ruling or side or the other, countries and all that. So why should the poor people of Afghanistan should suffer? I mean, they need all sort of support and help, not only from the regional powers, but also from the international community. And so far as, freedom from hunger is concerned, I mean, all sorts of help should be given to them, in spite of what is happening on the part of the rulers and all that. So thank you very much for a very enlightening session. And you have cleared many, issues. I mean, you have clarified many issues that have been, ringing in our minds. I mean, people at large, that what is happening in Afghanistan and all that. So thank you very much. And once again, I would like to thank you for sparing time and giving such a wonderful exposition of views on Afghanistan, because that is the focal, besides Ukraine or, Iran, Afghanistan remains, a perennial problem for the international community. Peace depends on what happens in Afghanistan. Now it has shifted to Ukraine. Before that, it was Taiwan. So, the focus of international attention goes on shifting from, but this Afghanistan problem has been there for a very long time.
Yes, yes.
Even when Taliban had not come, but even the focus was there. I mean, people were really interested in what is happening in Afghanistan.
Yes,
so thank you very much, and we hope to have you more in future also to seek your views on the very important country that is Afghanistan, which is not only has the attention of Pakistan and India as well, and it's in the interest of the subcontinent that the peace is there in Afghanistan. So thank you very much, and with your permission, I would like to close this session. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Gaur. Thank you. Take care.